Hey, welcome back, everyone. Yeah, so some new updates. Of course, now the impeachment of former President Donald Trump now has begun. Yesterday was, of course, the pre-trial, essentially, hearing of the Senate to determine whether they have the constitutional grounds to actually impeach him. They voted yes. 6 Republicans voted with them. And today was now the first day of the trials, right? I'll be going into a bit of what actually took place. Really, they didn't present any new evidence, although if you read other media, they do try to pump up what they've been doing. Giving them some credit, they're good at they're good at emotional narrative, but really based on what we've been discussing already on the show, they haven't really shown anything beyond what we knew they would show based on what they had told us they'd present anyways. And really, a lot of their information, if you know the context, if you know the actual story, you know it's taken out of context and you know it's not really accurate. And so, really, they're not doing anything new, meaning that very unlikely they're going to move people who have already established their positions based on the early presentation of the evidence there was. I'll be explaining this a bit more. Also, folks, going to go into some new updates on what's happening with social media, some big updates on this, and see how much time we have left for other stories as well. All right, folks, as always, if you have questions, I'll be doing some questions in just a bit, so leave them in the chat if you have any questions, and I'll be getting into them in just a bit. Yeah, good seeing you all. Hey, Courtney, good seeing you. Oswaldo Corrales, yeah, thank you. Yeah. Trump 2020, Lizzie, yeah, good to see you all. The drink tonight is Taiwanese mountain tea. Yeah, back to my old favorite. All right, folks, let's jump into the first story for the night. So I'll be mentioning some stuff on Georgia as well. Some folks were asking about that a bit ago. All right, let's jump into the stories first. All right, first one here. This is Epoch Times. It says impeachment managers present no new evidence of incitement. Now, it says here the Democratic House impeachment managers presented no new evidence during a crucial portion of their argument on February 10th, today, to support the allegation that President Donald Trump incited an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol last month. Now, the incitement accusation is at the core of the case against Trump, right? Who was impeached by the House last month for allegedly inciting protesters to breach the Capitol building on January 6th. Now, the impeachment managers devoted nearly 2 hours to lay out their evidence for the alleged provocation, right? Alleging that Trump provoked the crowd to go and breach the building. They cited Trump's statements dating back to the spring of last year through his speech on the day of the attack. Now, the presentation includes no smoking gun or new revelations to substantiate that Trump knowingly instigated a mob to attack the Capitol. Now, Representative Jamie Raskin, Democrat, said, quote, "We are having a trial on the facts." And, right, she's the lead impeachment manager, said this today, technically the second day of the impeachment, but the first day of the trials themselves. Now, the Democrats split their evidentiary presentation of the alleged crime, right? Alleging that Trump incited a mob to go and breach the Capitol building. They broke this into 3 parts: the provocation, Trump allegedly provoking it, the attack, and the, quote, harm. Now, the provocation leg of the presentation is crucial to substantiate the charge against Trump and is the keystone of the whole case against him. The presentation on February 10th largely rehashed the claims from the impeachment manager's trial briefs, which focused on Trump's tweets and public statements. Now, the impeachment managers wove a narrative alleging that Trump's legal and rhetorical challenges to the outcome of the election were part of some, sinister, premeditated campaign to program a portion of his supporters to commit violence on January 6th. Won't go too much deeper into this. You all know the story, right? Basically, though, they haven't said anything beyond what they were saying before. And we know what the story was, right? We know what the story was when it came to all this. Essentially, that they alleged that Trump, while he was speaking on January 6th in front of the Washington Monument, provoked people to go and attack the Capitol building and to stop things from happening, essentially. I was reporting there. I was one of the journalists there. I was in the press box. A lot of people weren't happy with the press, but I was in the press box. And he did not say anything of the sort. And really, the quotes they're using to make it seem like he said anything like that, they're taken out of context. And if Trump's team just plays the full context, you can very quickly see that. Not only that, but Trump said to be peaceful, right? Peacefully protest. And they've removed during the portion of the speeches that they actually quoted, they removed that part. They also took, as I mentioned, parts out of context where, for example, he says, "You've got to fight like hell." They make it seem like he's inciting people to go and fight like hell. But if you watch the full context of that, it's very obvious he's speaking about the legal team, talking about his legal actions, saying you've got to fight like hell with the legal actions. Now, it's important to note as well, the Supreme Court is not beyond the whole fake, election fraud stuff. The Supreme Court is still going to hear cases. They're scheduled to, at least, and we'll see if they actually do it. They're still scheduled to hear cases on Trump's challenges to the election, on Sidney Powell's challenges to the election, on Lin Wood's challenge to the election, and others. Meaning that anything filed before the Electoral College vote, right? Anything filed before the Electoral College vote is still fair game. And anything on that could still actually affect the outcome if they go back. I mean, if the government decides to actually go back and look, move forward with the actual legalities of this. If that does happen, actually, there's a chance it actually might get overturned to Trump. The issue we have is we don't really have precedent for most of what we're facing right now as a nation. And so we're in a lot of uncharted territory. Technically, they shouldn't even be allowed to impeach a former president, a private citizen. The Democrats are alleging that again, right? They're alleging again that in their interpretation of the Constitution, even though it's actually not written in the Constitution, technically what's written in the Constitution, you can impeach a current president. There's nothing about impeaching a former president. But in their particular interpretation of the Constitution, they're suggesting that the framers of the Constitution themselves would not allow a president during his last days in office to commit a crime and not be impeached. There's nothing in the Constitution that says this. In fact, this is also why, again, Chief Justice Roberts is not overseeing the impeachment trials as is normally required under the stated parts of the Constitution on that. I've repeated this before, so I won't go too deep into it, but here is basically where things are at with the impeachment. No new evidence, rehashing of what we've been talking about for the past several weeks already, information taken out of context, evidence, hard evidence actually working against them. But here's the reality, right? This isn't a normal trial, right? It's a Senate trial. And it's a Senate trial not even being overseen by the Chief Justice, Justice Roberts, as is normally required in an impeachment. And so the Democrats are essentially themselves the ones who said they were planning to impeach Trump going back to 2017 and tried last year and basically were trying on everything that came out. Remember, during Trump's entire presidency, there was rolling scandals, debunked one after the next, Trump-Russia hoax, fake rape accusations, you name it, right? His phone call with Ukrainians, and so on, quid pro quo. Debunked one after the next, essentially, as evidence started coming out. Now, it's these same individuals who've been trying to impeach him since 2017 in their own statements, who, by altering the evidence, taking information out of context, are trying to impeach him now. And really, they're voting in lockstep. This is a political trial, not a normal civil trial, right? And as a political trial, they're voting along political lines, as well as it seems maybe 6 Republicans are pretty much positioned to vote with the Democrats at this point, meaning they don't have the votes, right? They need 2/3 majority. They don't have it currently. And very likely this is just the way things are going right now. All right, folks, let me go into another story here. This is from Fox News. It says Biden lays out prescription for U.S.-China relations in his first call with Xi Jinping since taking office. Now, a lot of us especially those of you who watch this show, because I've talked a lot about China, a lot of us have been waiting to see what Biden's policy on China is, because of course he has a lot of accusations against him, and proven accusations of family ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Hunter Biden, for example, is not pulled out of some of his business ties with China, it seems, based on the evidence we're seeing. And a lot of people are concerned that Biden is close with Xi Jinping, which again, if you go back to the Obama administration when Biden was vice president, Biden was in charge of the Asia pivot, as they called it, which included a large diplomatic shift and military shift to the Asia Pacific region. Biden was in charge of meeting with Xi Jinping, head of the Chinese Communist Party. And during those meetings, he and Hunter Biden left with very big business deals with China. Well, technically Hunter Biden, right? So what's happening now? Let's go into this. Biden just had his first call with Xi Jinping since he's taken office. And here's what happened, according to Fox News. It says President Biden committed to pursuing practical, result-oriented engagements when it advances the interests of the American people and those of our allies, according to the White House. Let's go into this a bit. It says President Biden spoke with Chinese President. Is he really a president? We won't get into that. Technically, he's like chair of the Chinese Communist Party, right? All right, with Chinese President Xi Jinping for the first time Wednesday night since taking office, outlining his administration's core concerns with China's practices, aggressive activities, and abuses, signaling a, quote, clear and consistent subscription to American values, while discussing areas in which the administration believes it could be in the U.S. national interest to work with Beijing, senior administration officials said. Now, in a statement Wednesday night, the White House said Biden, quote, shared his greetings and well wishes with the Chinese people on the occasion of the Lunar New Year. Lunar New Year for them is about a week long, and it's like the Christmas for China and for other Asian countries as well. You know, it's a big holiday, and it's actually coming up. It says here, quote, President Biden affirmed his priorities of protecting. Actually, I think it's tomorrow on that. Anyway, so we'll get into that. It says here, quote, President Biden affirmed his priorities of protecting the American people's security, prosperity, health, and way of life, and preserving a free and open Indo-Pacific, according to the White House. It continues, President Biden underscored his fundamental concerns about Beijing's coercive and unfair economic practices, crackdown in Hong Kong, human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and increasingly assertive actions in the region, including toward Taiwan. Notably missing are persecution of the Tibetans, persecution of the Mongolians, persecution of Falun Gong practitioners, persecution of house Christians. Now, the White House said Biden and Xi, head of the Chinese Communist Party, quote, also exchanged views on countering the COVID-19 pandemic and the shared challenges of global health security, climate change, and preventing weapons proliferation. President Biden committed to pursuing practical, results-oriented engagements when it advances the interests of the American people and those of our allies. And senior administration officials before the call Wednesday night said that Biden would lay down the, quote, range of concerns he has with China's actions and policies while ensuring that the two leaders keep, quote, an open line of communication. What does this mean? Not a whole lot, to be honest. It basically means that he's keeping up the same criticisms of the CCP that have been stated in just about every diplomatic engagement based on PC level concerns that you've had since like the Obama days. I mean, they didn't really call out the persecution of Muslim Uyghurs, but now that this is one of the surface issues, now it's being called around the world, the CCP will concede that ground typically. The issue you have, again, isn't whether Biden is actually talking with them. The issue you have is, one, whether he maintains the sanctions Trump put on China, which is a big deal, and two, whether he continues to hold the CCP accountable in practical ways, right? In other words, holding them accountable if they violate international systems, if they launch cyber attacks, if they do things that are unethical, we sanction them, like Trump was doing. That was the precedent established by Trump, right? And that was the precedent that really actually worked. If we go back to Nixon and his engagement with China during the Amur Valley conflict with Russia, when China and Russia were not friends with each other, to say the least, he of course made deals with China, brought them into trade agreements and so on. These were enhanced by the Clinton administration, like getting them access to the World Trade Organization, things like that. Continued under Bush, continued under Obama, continued under Clinton, of course, going back a bit further, as I mentioned. And now Trump, of course, came in and kind of threw a wrench into the normal ways that diplomacy was done. And with that, you had a lot of people who really didn't like Trump because of that, because he broke a lot of the rules when it comes to diplomacy. But the issue we saw was he was dealing with diplomacy in the same way that you would deal with a business deal, where if you make a deal and they violate the deal, you either sue them, right, if you're doing business, or in this case, sanction them, or you pull out of the deal and tell them we're going to renegotiate and you better give me the money you owe me, right? This is how he dealt with China, and that was the only thing that ever worked with them. That was the only thing we've ever seen, really, in terms of big issues. That was the only thing we've ever seen done on the presidential level that actually worked with China. Now, the big question is that now Biden's engaging with them, and yes, you can call them out, you can call them names and so on. They actually don't really care about that. They understand, and actually the Chinese Communist Party, they've even had articles stating this in the past. For example, when Hillary Clinton and Trump were running for president the first time, China actually had articles, Chinese state media actually had articles saying, expect Hillary to criticize us, but, it's just what she has to do. They were saying this. It was just what she has to do in order to appease American voters. That was the understanding of China, publicly written in some of their articles. And the CCP understands this, that certain areas of criticism become necessary when it becomes the basic areas of criticism, which are expected with engagement. But if it's just empty talk, they don't care. The big issue here now is he's talking about re-engaging with them, helping the Chinese people by engaging with the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the way you help the Chinese people is by helping them challenge the powers and abuses of the Chinese Communist Party, not making deals with them that reinvigorate their powers over the Chinese people. We'll have to see how this goes, because in terms of practical terms, right, in terms of what they're actually doing practically, there's nothing here about that. Basically, he's just saying that they're having these discussions, they're re-engaging on some diplomatic level. They're talking about, we'll have to see what they do with the trade deal. We'll have to see what they do on getting rid of the sanctions. That was one issue that he did suggest before. He said he wasn't speaking specifically about China. Sorry, Biden wasn't speaking specifically about China, but the nature of his comments seemed to suggest it, where he said that in order to help countries deal with the virus and their virus responses, maybe we'll alleviate some of the sanctions, essentially. It's possible they might do that. Now, we'll have to wait and see how this develops, but wanted to mention that briefly. Now, folks, I want to go over one more story because this is a big one. Then I'll jump into some questions. This is actually interesting because it shows now what the Republicans are planning to do, and it seems to be aligning with the office of the former president, Trump's new movement. And it says here, this is Epoch Times, House Republicans targeting 47 vulnerable Democrats to retake House majority in 2022. And this is their strategy, right? This is Trump's strategy, working on the grassroots, community organizing, ground up, cultural change, essentially. It says here, House Republicans released a plan to retake the House majority in 2022 by targeting 47 districts with vulnerable Democrats. It says the National Republican Congressional Committee, the NRCC, noted in a memo that the Republican Party is just 5 seats away from holding a majority in the House of Representatives, saying that the GOP can be competitive in 4 dozen districts. And this is according to the chairman, Tom Emmer, in a release. He said, quote, "We are just a few weeks into the Biden administration, and Americans are already seeing the job-killing initiatives House Democrats support. We will relentlessly hold House Democrats accountable for their socialist agenda and ensure voters understand the damaging impact policies like defunding the police, government-run healthcare, and ending the Keystone XL pipeline will have on Americans' everyday lives. Now, could they do this? Possibly. Now, what is interesting now that wasn't in place previously is the element of Trump. He was president, right? He was president working from the top down, right? And he was president really kind of assuming people maybe supported him who didn't, who were acting for their own interests. I would say that Trump now, after what happened with, for example, Pence, after what happened with Barr, after what happened with other people in his administration who were fired at the 11th hour, essentially, and who turned on him, for example, voting for impeachment or other things, I think this was a pretty, and this is purely my assessment based on just what I've seen, I think this was a pretty big blow to Trump. During his speech, for example, on January 6th in front of the National Monument, in front of the Washington Monument, Trump was putting all of his hopes in Pence, basically. That Pence would, again, recognize the dueling electors, right? There were dueling electors in 7 states, and he would toss out the governor's electors, essentially, the votes from them. Or at the very least, send them back to the state legislature to vote. Because in a lot of these cases, the Democrats bypassed the state legislature in order to do what they did, which would have meant dueling electors. The whole dueling elector thing is basically written off at this point. No one really mentions it. Trump put all of his hopes in Pence. Pence worked with the Democrats, did not do that. Rest is history, right? Now, what's going to be interesting going back into this is that going forward now, what's happening, before all of this, typically it was the Democrats who worked on the grassroots. The Republicans were not really good at that, to be honest. You did have a few politicians in different states who Trump endorsed. Some of them turned out to support him later. Some actually turned against him. Won't go over all of them, but there were quite a few. Now, seeing this, what is Trump going to do? Now, essentially, Republicans have a very wealthy individual, a billionaire, who was interested in working on community organizing, grassroots organizing, voter drives, and so on. Trump is like the anti-Soros now to the Republican Party. He's like, Trump is what Soros was to the Democrats, but for the Republicans at this point, right? This is what Trump is at this point. He's engaging in the grassroots level of politics and having influence at the higher levels of politics as well. And this is how the Soros strategy works. It's this above and below strategy. You agitate the grassroots to call for policies that you want to implement, and then have the people at the top react to them. Trump now has the ability to do the same thing, essentially through his networks of influence and through what he's very likely going to be doing, as publicly stated, under his new, quote unquote, office of the former president, right? It's going to be very interesting. And based on this, actually, it is very possible that Republicans could not only gain a majority, but gain a pretty serious majority of the House of Representatives. And this is also the stated purpose of Trump's office of the former president. One of the main things they're talking about doing. Some folks saying there's an explosion in Washington tonight. Was there an explosion in Washington? Sorry, folks. One sec. My computer's acting up. All right. Let me go over a few questions, and we'll go from there. So let's see here. This is from X8. From X8, you say, "Hey Josh, can you explain to us the Middle East peace deal, by the way, between Israel and UAE? What did Trump do differently than previous presidents to make them agree?" You know, it's actually not clear exactly, in my assessment, it's not actually clear how he did it. He basically encouraged them to just come together. I think, okay, so there are a couple things that he did. One is that he kind of pushed out Palestine, right? The Palestinians out of the whole equation. And by challenging Iran's influence within those countries, and Iran is very close to Palestine, they even reimburse suicide bombers and things like that. By capitalizing on the conflict between Iran and the UAE and other countries like Saudi Arabia, was able to use that division by pushing Iran out of the equation, to get these Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, for example, to play greater roles within the region. Trump basically got the Prince of Saudi Arabia to become the de facto leader of a lot of the Muslim world. A lot of people criticized him on that. You might remember the journalist who was killed. He wrote, I think, a couple articles, but it's different analysis on how much of a journalist he actually was. Basically, Trump allowed the UAE, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and other countries to have more influence within the region, and by helping them challenge and suppress Iran rather than giving them pallets of cash and so on. And by getting rid of the Iran nuclear deal, and also by hitting their finances in different ways with sanctions, and by preventing them from using that money to finance terrorist operations, and by bombing them and their generals, for example, when they tried carrying out attacks on Americans. Trump disarmed Iran. Trump eliminated the actions of the Quad the military force they have there, right? Which actually functions more as like a subversive terrorist organization by infiltrating other countries and instigating terrorist acts in those countries. Trump put an end to that. Well, not total end, but he put a big damper on it. By doing that, he allowed these other countries that don't have such an extreme view of Islam to play a much greater role within the Muslim world. And through that, he allowed them to even make deals with Israel, which, based on a lot of the more extremist narratives, they would never normally do. And so that's essentially what he did. Now, I'll go briefly into this because some of the history on that's actually important. I mentioned before the history of socialism and so on. Actually, the history of, for example, Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, is interesting because a lot of this goes into the Egyptian model of Islam, which they cited, which was actually a merging of Sharia law with socialism. There was a book called In the Footsteps of the Quran by a guy named, I can't pronounce it, it's like Qutb. Basically, what he did was reinterpreted Islam through the lens of socialism. And Al-Qaeda was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood branch in Egypt. And there were a lot of the revolutions taking place. For example, Arafat, financed by the Soviets. There are a lot of books on this, for example, working to instigate communist revolutions in different parts of the Muslim world, including in Iran. And they tried doing the same thing. They tried actually doing the same thing in Saudi Arabia. That was the history of the Red Prince. It's actually really interesting history that's not really well known. If you look at the Prince's Rebellion, they had an individual they called the Red Prince. I believe it was the father of Alawid bin Talal, the guy who was like an investor in Twitter. And essentially, yeah, I do need a haircut. Yeah, thank you, Mary. Gorilla Glue, thank you. Right, essentially what happened was they tried launching this Prince's Rebellion to establish in Saudi Arabia the Egyptian model of Islam, which was the socialist model of Islam. Now, there were subversive movements within the community of princes to implement this. And the current prince, basically, well, first of all, during the Prince's Rebellion, that was put down. Again, the history of the Red Prince, as they call it. And more recently, again, the current prince put down a lot of those princes as well. You might remember the story, for example, of that, I believe his name's Alawid bin Talal, being hung upside down by his feet, allegedly. And a lot of the mainstream media were very angry about it. Well, long story short, these individuals who were doing subversive movements within that area of the world were put down. And because they were put down, they were able to work with the United States, including with Trump. And Trump was able to help them negotiate all of this, right? Now, we'll have to see what happens with Biden now, because it does seem to be the case that he's going to re-engage with Iran, it seems to be the case he's going to try to reestablish some of the status quo of how things were being done before. And, this is going to be interesting to watch. And I had a discussion with someone earlier today about this. Actually, Pastor Greg of Chosen Generation Radio was on his show this morning. it's actually interesting because basically what Biden is doing with these executive orders, over 40 of them now, is he's reestablishing, right? He is now reestablishing the status quo. He's rolling back everything Trump did. And the status quo of how things were done before was the Republicans and the Democrats, the old guard of the Republicans and Democrats before Trump. They're basically trying to roll, it seems, right? They're basically trying to roll things back and make it how it was before Trump. The problem they have is that Trump actually impacted not just American culture deeply, but also global culture. And a lot of the policies he had actually benefited not just Americans, but also many people around the world. If you start rolling back all those benefits they have now, even though people criticize them, people will feel the pain as they lose those benefits. And again, you have a lot of people now in this country who have become very, very much aware of how our government actually functions, who have become very, very aware of the degree of corruption within not only our government, but many other governments, and not just governments, but the way that business and government work together, the way media and government work together. And they've seen also a lot of the masks fall off. People they believe they could trust, individuals they believe they could trust, institutions they believe they could trust, which acted out in various ways and really showed their true colors. Rolling all that back now is virtually impossible because the culture of not just the United States, but a lot of the world has been fundamentally changed. And so, yeah, what happened in the Middle East with their peace deal with Israel is one example of that. Now, this is from Green Eyed Lady. You said, I'd like to know why the National Guard was not posted to the Capitol on January 6th. Trump offered 10,000 National Guards troops on January 6th. So yeah, they turned it down. He said, seems the FBI was aware in advance that a riot was being planned. Yeah, and if they were monitoring this, which they claim seems that they were at this point, and at the very least, if the moderators at Facebook and Twitter, which a lot of the stuff was actually planned on, mostly Facebook, not Parler notably, if they were moderating that and managing that, which seems that they do pretty thoroughly, yeah, they would have known. And so that does raise a serious question, is if they did know this was going to happen, and there was alleged pre-planning, again, one of the other pieces of evidence that Trump did not incite it, technically they should have had more guards, not less. Technically, they should have accepted Trump's offer of 10,000 National Guards troops. Technically, they maybe shouldn't have made a stand-down order for local police during this. And technically, maybe they should have not, opened up the gates and waved people into the Capitol building. I think that may have actually prevented people from entering the building had they not opened the gates and waved them into the building. Just a hunch. All right, let's see here. I'll do one more question. We'll go deeper into some of the stories for the night. This is from XD Eriority. I'm probably saying some of these names wrong. He said, I read Georgia's Fulton County DA is going to be investigating their elections. Have you heard this? Yes, that is happening. Let me get into it because it's one of the stories I want to talk about tonight. I'll do one more question because I want to get into that in just a bit. This is from War Games. He said, Joshua, can a private citizen Trump take the appeal a potential conviction to the SCOTUS Supreme Court? To be honest, this is the question I also have, and it's one I'm trying to get answers to currently. I don't know the answer to that yet. I'm trying to find it. And it's a serious one, is that if Trump believes, for example, that Democrats violated the Constitution during the trial process, and already you didn't have normal protocol in the way the House put through the indictment, right? Basically, so what happens, the House does the impeachment indictment, the Senate takes care of the actual trial part of it. And could Trump, based on the fact that a lot of this is not really lining up with the Constitution, that they have presented edited information to basically present false information during the trials, and that they violated the Constitution, it seems, even on the grounds of impeaching him, right? Or moving forward to impeach him as a private citizen. Could he take that and actually go to the Supreme Court and file charges against them or sue the government or something. I don't see why not, personally, because you and I, as private citizens, could, for example, charge the government with things like that, but it would have to. I'm looking for answers on it, because a lot of what's happening right now is a bit bizarre, and it's actually hard to tell. A lot of you saying there's an explosion that took place. Let me check the news real quick. Oh yeah, wait, this is an hour ago. Oh yeah, here we go. Let me get this up, actually. Now, okay, this is purely according to mainstream media at this point, so I can't verify any of this. It's breaking news. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, yeah, late as always, right? No, I can't verify any of this, right? This is breaking news right now. It happened just a bit ago. Um, I'll just read to you what Daily Beast is saying right now. This is their article. It said, "We just had an explosion, and Democrats are airing chilling videos, dispatch audio in the impeachment trial." Okay, so this doesn't seem to be an actual explosion. It seems to be them alleging during the impeachment trial that an explosion took place. So not like we think, right? They say, quote, multiple capital injuries. They're throwing metal poles at us. Multiple law enforcement injuries. DSO, get up here. And it says, the antagonizing sound of DC cops begging for reinforcements rang out in the U.S. Senate on Wednesday when House Democratic impeachment managers aired chilling new audio and security footage capturing the chaos that unfolded on January 6th. Now, we've seen videos from inside the Capitol building. Yeah, some people were a bit violent. It seems to be that they're exaggerating a lot of this in terms of the seriousness of it. 5 people did die, which is pretty serious, but the context of it is important. Ashley Babbitt shot and killed by Capitol Police. Again, when you had about 3 to 4 heavily armed police officers right behind her, right, carrying rifles right behind her, and 2 to 3 officers standing right in front of the door who moved to the side, meaning you had at least 5 officers literally right next to her, meaning that this was unnecessary use of force, very likely. If this had happened to a Democrats or BLM, they'd be burning down the city, right? Right. 3 other people died of health issues during the riots, during the protests more, and 1 officer was killed, allegedly. But the context of that is actually coming out now. Now, media, CNN and so on, allege that he was beaten to death by Trump supporters with a fire extinguisher. It's coming out now that this is very likely a lie. Seems that was a lie. The actual evidence coming out now suggests that he had inhaled some of the tear gas, and he had health complications from that. For example, he had conversations with his brother that were released saying he was fine, but saying he got tear gas twice. That was the extent of it. And so the media and the Democrats in this case have been really not been honest with what actually happened on January 6th. Just being straight, right? They're not being honest with what actually happened. Technically, imagine if there was a protest of BLM and 1 individual was shot in the neck by police when you had at least 5 officers standing right next to him. When people next to them were not being violent, they broke a window, person climbed through, Capitol Police shot that person, 5 officers standing right behind that person. What would the reaction be? If during a protest 3 individuals died of health complications, would they say, "Oh, that's terrible," or would they say it's the police's fault for, coming after them so hard? And if an officer even was killed because of inhaling the smoke of, that they were using, what do you think the reaction would be? Do you think the reaction would be going after BLM and calling them terrorists? Or do you think the reaction would be, we need to defund the police and, defund the people who are in charge of security and go after them and, burn down the town, which was actually what BLM was marching down the street the other day saying? What do you think would happen, right? What you're watching again is a media establishment working very closely with the political establishment with a very partisan goal of really hating Trump and doing anything they can to hate Trump, basically, to act on their hatred of Trump. Anyways, Yeah, so this is from Green Eyed Lady. Said Josh is talking about Officer Sicknick. He did not have a head injury as reported by the fake news mainstream media. Yeah, exactly. They said that he died from this head injury. There was a lot of, they do these narrative-based reporting where they try to illustrate the scene. It was fake. The stories on that were fake. And they're not releasing the medical reports. The evidence we have now coming out is that he actually talked to his brother after the protests, and information on that suggests he said he was fine. The only issue he had was that he inhaled smoke because he was tear gassed twice, and he was an officer, the ones using the tear gas, right? Right. Fake narratives, fake story, emotional agitation, using fake narratives and fake stories in order to create an impeachment of a private citizen, because really it's what they've been saying they wanted to do since 2017. This is the real story, right? All right, let's go into a few other stories for the night. Now, this is Donald Jr., Trump Jr., and it does seem to be the case. Sorry, all of you are saying this explosion. Let me look for this real quick because I don't want to miss this story if this is happening. Let's see. You're saying Candace Owens explosion at house. I'm actually not seeing the story, folks. You have to forgive me. I don't see the story on this. We'll see if we can find it. I can have my team look for it. But if we find it, I'll talk about it. You're saying somebody's saying manhole explosion and so on. All right, let's move into some other stories until we can locate that. Some of you are saying it's on Candace Owens's Telegram. All right, folks, I'll look real quick because I think that this is important if it's actually happening. Let's see here. I do have Telegram, by the way, which actually has become the #1 most downloaded app, apparently, within its category. Right, Candace Owens, let's see what she's saying. Oh, yeah, here you go. Now she's talking about the DC explosion again. Let's see. So she's saying a fire and DC fire and emergency medical. All right, let's see what I'll go over the story with you right now. What's happening? Yeah, this is Candace Owens, and she's talking about something that happened an hour ago. And this is from DC Fire and EMS. It says update CO incident 1300 block Vermont Ave Northwest. Still have elevated readings. Also investigating smoking manhole outside the structure. Pepco Connect on scene in the process of ventilating the building. Yeah, there's not a lot of evidence yet in terms of what happened. El Paso Fire Department. This is a few days ago. Yeah, evidence is still coming out, and not much we can say at this point until we get some updates. But it does seem to be that there was an explosion involving a manhole. It's now maybe someone like dropped a cigarette in a manhole and it exploded. That has happened. Maybe it was someone put an explosive in a manhole. The information on this is too new right now for me to make any speculation of what actually happened, but it is a bit weird. I'll keep you all updated if we hear anything on it. All right, let's go into some other stories for the night. Now, this is Epoch Times again. It says Donald Trump Jr. says Republicans need to fight back or they'll never win another election. And you should interpret this alongside the Republicans' new plan, because they're coming out right at the same time. The Republicans' new plan, right, to take back the House, and Trump's stated plan to help Republicans take back both the House and the Senate. And really, I know a lot of people are concerned about the integrity of our elections right now. I know there's a lot of concern around that. Keep in mind, a lot of the changes to election laws were done by bypassing the state legislatures. In a lot of these key states, the state legislatures are still controlled by Republicans. And again, you still have trials moving forward, different investigations into what happened with the elections. In Virginia, for example, you had this, right? In Virginia, for example, you had the analysis of the elections take place, and they determined that what was done in the 2020 elections was illegal, meaning that going forward, if different states actually do audits, if different states look into this, and many of them are, Virginia, even some parts of New York, they actually overturned a House seat from a Democrat to a Republican because they deemed that the election was not done properly with one of the House elections. You have investigations being done in Arizona, notably 2 different ones, one in Maricopa County, one through the state Senate. The Maricopa County one has some holes in it. That's going to be the one very likely used in the big media narratives. The one to watch is the Senate audit in Georgia as well. And what does this mean? It means very likely that many states, not under Democrat control, can be flipped back to Republican, because some of the areas that were won through the loosening of election regulations are going to be retightened. And very likely, if you put the checks and balances back in place, it means you have a better chance, right, of a fair election if there's checks and balances. And if Trump is working again as like the grassroots, voice to go in there and actually push things, you're likely going to have a lot of people go to the polls and vote. They have a strong shot at it. And Don Jr. saying Republicans need to fight back or they'll never win another election, which I know a lot of people feel right now as well. It's probably true, to be honest. All right. Now, on the note of Georgia, I'll go into this. Oh, real quick, Death's API, you're saying, it says carbon monoxide incident, but carbon monoxide doesn't cause an explosion. That's interesting. Yeah, CO, carbon monoxide. Yeah, well, this is on the manhole explosion. Again, you're noting that CO doesn't cause an explosion. Yeah, I'll keep you all updated on what we hear with this. It's breaking news, and so the degree, the level of information we have on it is too little to actually to really know anything going on right now. I'll keep you all updated if we hear updates on it. Now, this is from Epoch Times again. It says, Georgia prosecutor probing attempts to influence the 2020 elections. And this is important. Now, this is important because, as I mentioned, a lot of what we have going on with the elections, a lot of the lawsuits and so on, even if you're being told that, okay, so one of the big arguments you'll hear a lot of pundits noting and commentators noting, and a lot of the mainstream media noting, is they'll say, oh, all of Trump's lawsuits failed. Judges declared that his evidence was bunk. There was nothing there. You're all a bunch of conspiracy theorists and insurrectionists, and should go be re-educated in the FEMA gulags or something like that, right? what they're essentially saying right now. I'm exaggerating a little bit. Well, actually, not really. If you read some of their statements, but if you look into what actually happened, the challenges to the election, 2/3 of them have actually been successful. 2/3 of the challenges to the election have been successful, the ones where evidence was actually heard. And again, as I've mentioned, right? You do still have the Supreme Court set to hear cases, right? You have the Supreme Court set to hear cases on what happened in the 2020 election, lawsuits brought by Trump, his team, lawsuits brought by Cindy Powell, lawsuits brought by Lin Wood, right? And each of these, as we've mentioned before, all of this, going back to the early days of the challenges to the election, if we go back, as I mentioned, they were saying, and we'll have to see how it plays out, but technically, legally, this is how it would work, that any lawsuits filed prior to the Electoral College vote could still overturn the election. And maybe, as I've suggested last night, maybe this is why they want so badly to impeach Trump, because if the election is overturned based on the challenges to the election being brought to the Supreme Court, in which the Supreme Court is scheduled to hear coming up very soon, if it does overturn, it'll go to Trump. But what happens then if Trump is impeached? Well, it's uncharted territory. Who knows? They could say he can't be president because he's been impeached. And I suggested as well, maybe that's also why they waited. Maybe that's why they delayed the passing of the impeachment papers to the Senate, because maybe they wanted to wait till they had a supermajority. Maybe they wanted to wait till the Georgia elections until they knew they had the seats they needed to have the majority. It does seem to be the case, based on my analysis, that would be possible, right? We can't say exactly what their intentions were, but it does make sense. Now, on this, back to this. This is what's happening in Georgia right now. It says a district attorney on February 10th asked state officials to preserve records potentially related to the 2020 election, as she revealed that her office has opened a probe into attempts to influence the administration of the election. It says the investigation includes, quote, potential violations of Georgia law prohibiting the solicitation of election fraud, the making of false statements to state and local government bodies, conspiracy, racketeering, violation of oath of office, and any involvement in violence or threats related to the elections administration. Fulton County District Attorney Fannie Willis, a Democrat, said in a letter to Republican Governor Brian Kemp and other officials. Important to note with this, it's basically the Democrats pushing back on this one. But by introducing this, saying potential violations of the law, essentially, for making false statements to state and local government bodies, conspiracy, racketeering, violation of oath of office, and any involvement in violence or threats related to election administration. If Georgia moves forward with that, you're very likely going to see this same thing happen in other states where the tables were turned and where Republicans were the ones facing those attacks, including threats against their lives. You might remember even, for example, Trump telling his administration to move forward with, basically affirming the transition to the Biden administration. That was being blocked, and the woman who blocked it, not only herself, but even her family members and her children were being threatened. You did have a lot of this. You even had some of the dueling electors who were blocked from entering to cast their votes, entering the government buildings to cast their votes in some states. The way a lot of this could be challenged, if the Democrats do choose to, try this battle, so to speak, out, the way this could be challenged in the way other states could respond to it, this could blow up in their faces, essentially. I'll keep you all updated on this as we go forward, of course. So I'm just checking out your comments. Be keeping updated as this goes forward, especially when it comes to what's happening now with the Supreme Court, because this is the big one to watch, and it seems to be the main story that nobody wants to talk about. All right, let's go into some other stories. Now, Mike Lindell, right, the pillow guy, My Pillow, right? Mike Lindell says sales remain strong amid cancel culture. Now, anybody essentially who is continuing to call out the integrity of the 2020 election, and given the fact that, again, some of what was done has been deemed illegal, like in Virginia, given that 2/3 of the cases have actually succeeded, right? Given all of this, contesting it and noting the actual legal evidence should not be something that's suppressed. You're talking about facts, right? Now, My Pillow's Lindell says sales remain strong amid cancel culture. They went after for putting together these documentaries about what happened in the elections. Now, My Pillow CEO Mike Lindell said on February 9th that sales of the company's signature product remain strong after several retailers recently stopped stocking the pillows. And he said this: we've actually increased in sales. We're actually up in sales. Our shipping is behind. Now, Wayfair and Bed Bath & Beyond, among other retailers, stopped selling My Pillow last month. The companies faced pressure from activists who disliked Lindell's involvement in pursuing election fraud claims. And Lindell said those were bots and trolls they were afraid of. Now, what are we seeing, right? We're seeing cancel culture. We're seeing them going after people, and we're seeing anybody who challenges the status quo. And we're seeing a lot of big businesses pretty much trying to act as the government in this case, trying to act as the essentially people setting laws on what kind of speech is allowed and what kind of speech is not allowed. And yeah, somebody mentioning best pillow ever. Actually, I do have one of his pillows as well, and I actually like it quite a bit. And I'm not getting paid for this, right? This isn't like an ad for him, but I give it from someone who travels a lot and sleeps in some decent hotels sometimes and has very nice pillows sometimes. I can say that actually Mike Lindell's pillows, the My Pillow stuff, they're actually really good pillows. Right? I'm not getting ad money from him. This is purely a side note on my own experience with these pillows. They're good pillows, honestly. But again, right, what's happening with this though is you have cancel culture. You have private businesses going after individuals who challenge the political status quo that they seem to support. And it's interesting to watch what's happening, right? It's interesting to watch what's actually happening with some of these companies because they're going against actual business interest. And it's interesting to watch as well that despite their attempts to shut these people down and kill their markets and so on, it's actually having the opposite effect. And a lot of these cases, when they try to shut people down with very few exceptions, like Parler, which they fully shut down, although honestly, the bounce back of Parler is going to be probably very big once they do go back online. And they were saying earlier they'd be back online early this week. We haven't seen it yet. We often see the case that when they do things like this, the public reaction is to actually help these companies. And this does actually show something interesting because it shows the grassroots of the country no longer aligns with the political influencers and big business influencers, that they no longer have the level of influence that they believe they have. All right, folks, let's go over one more story or a couple more stories, and it's getting a bit late. Now, real quick on some social media updates. I'll go over some of these quickly because small updates, some of them. First of all, the CFO of Twitter, Chief Financial Officer, is saying Trump will not be allowed back on Twitter again. And briefly on this, Twitter CFO Ned Siegel said, quote, "If you are removed from the platform, you are removed from the platform. Whether you're a commentator, you're a CFO, or whether you're a former or current political official." Going a bit further into what's happening right now, Facebook, next story here. Facebook is moving to reduce political content. Now, folks, if you're a platform where users post most of your content, how do you reduce political content, right? How do you reduce political content on a platform where you're not the one publishing the content, right? Another word for that would be censorship, right? But let's go into this a bit because sometimes there's nuances with these things, of course. Now, Facebook said Wednesday, today, it will move to muffle the reach of political content on the social media platform, saying it will start testing news feeds for users in Canada, Indonesia, and Brazil. Why are they testing the waters in Canada, Indonesia, and Brazil? Seeing how that works. They do slow rollouts on these things sometimes to see how big of a backlash there is from the public, right? It seems this is the case. Now, Facebook's product management director said, quote, "During these initial tests, we'll explore a variety of ways to rank political content in people's feeds using different signals and then decide on the approaches we'll use going forward." In other words, they're testing systems to limit the ability of you to share articles that you like with your friends and family on their platform. Meaning that if you still use these platforms and believe that if you post something that your friends and family are actually going to see it and something's happening, the impact of that is very likely very limited unless you align with their political interests. Yeah, wild times. And briefly as well, a Texas lawmaker, again, Texas and Florida are now pushing forward with bills to basically repeal through local law Section 230 protections on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms, which could allow people in those states to actually file lawsuits possibly if these platforms violate freedom of speech laws, for example, in these states, or political freedom of speech laws in these states, or to the extent that maybe in Florida, they're talking about putting $100,000 a day fines on, for example, platforms that suppress political candidates during elections. Now, they're saying in Texas, the law is on our side to do this. And we'll have to see what happens with that, but I think we're going to see a lot of movement on this. All right, folks, it's getting kind of late, so I just want to mention a few things. Now, when it comes to social media, now, and with actually what's happening with the grassroots, with Trump moving forward the grassroots of the Republican plan to retake the House and saying that they can overturn maybe 47 seats, with the spectrum of issues we're looking at right now. Now, there's actually a phenomenon that's very good to keep in mind, which is that if for those of you who know marketing, right? How does marketing work? Marketing works on emotion. Because, and the same thing with politics, right? The nature of the October surprise with politics and the elections, the October surprise hits people emotionally, and they're more likely to react physically. For example, go out and vote at the polls if they've been hit emotionally, if they've been agitated emotionally. That's the purpose of the October surprise. Same thing with marketing. People are more likely to act, to buy, and so on if you can appeal to their emotions. This is one of the more deceptive natures of new journalism, is that they basically write narrative-based articles explaining situations, which makes you feel that you've gone through an actual experience with it, and you develop emotional memory on that issue. And then they try to tell you that that emotional experience you had is a symbol of, such and such policy, and so you associate those emotions with that policy. This is one of the ways mainstream media manipulates you emotionally. But when it comes to this nature, it's not always a bad thing. Again, marketing works to this, appealing to people emotionally to drive them to go and buy a product or support an issue. What's interesting right now is that the actions of the big media, the actions of big government, and the actions of big tech right now, censoring people, calling people terrorists, talking about the need to cleanse the Trump movement, the attempted impeachment of Trump as a private citizen now. All of this, right, is making people very, very riled up emotionally. And what is going to be the impact of people getting very, very, very riled up emotionally? I would argue that I don't think we're going to see violence, but I think what we will see is that as soon as there is a platform that gives people a voice, as soon as there's a platform or a movement people can get behind and feel like they're represented, people are going to get behind it in droves we have never seen before. And really, what is that going to mean? As soon as there is a free speech platform, whether it's Parler coming back online, whether it's the Trump family now talking about the possibility of starting their own social media, as soon as that goes online, that is going to be huge. And as soon as that is huge, their ability to have control over information again and have a place for free speech, this is going to whittle away deeply the influence and ability to censor and control the narrative of the far left and the mainstream media. And at the same time, as soon as Trump, as it seems he's going to do, and very likely I think we'll see this as soon as the impeachment ends in a couple days, as soon as Trump is cleared of the impeachment, we're going to see grassroots Trump. We're going to see the anti-Soros Trump, Soros the white, Soros as he should have been, coming out as Trump to basically work on the grassroots. And I guarantee you, people are going to get behind him in droves because they feel they're under attack right now. They feel they don't have a voice, and they feel agitated, and they're looking for something to get behind. They're looking for hope. The actions right now, going after people as hard as they are, rather than trying to, quell emotions and calm people down and, make a time to heal, quote unquote, it's going to backfire. It's going to backfire very likely in a way that dismantles some of their control over infrastructure and information, and possibly even politics as it moves forward. It's going to be very interesting to watch at the very least. And I think as soon as the impeachment trials are over, we're going to start seeing that maybe in a week or two. I think, pure speculation, but I think based on the way we're seeing things moving. All right, folks, it's getting late, so we'll call it a night here. Always enjoy talking with you all. I'll be back on tomorrow night, 10:30 p.m. Eastern time, doing this live again, so tune in again, please. And as well, check out some of the interviews we've been publishing. Of course, a lot of the interviews I have recently are more religious seeming because we just got back from Content 2020. It was a Christian film festival, and they gave Epoch Times an award for our documentaries. It was really nice of them. Also, I'm going to be doing a lot on cancel culture. Actually, this book here, we're going to have the author on very soon, The Plot to Change America, and talking about some of these different movements. I'm going to be having a lot of new features coming out, interviews coming out, exposing the inner workings of a lot of the surface issues we're watching in this country. And I'm hoping to help keep alive the traditions that are under assault right now, hoping to keep alive the discussions that we need to have in this country in terms of maintaining some degree of sanity with the madness we see unfolding with cancel culture and identity politics and so on. And also hoping to give you guys some good old-fashioned, straightforward journalism as well. All right, folks, always enjoy talking with you all. And as always, appreciate all of you. Please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.